Things are looking good. I've rarely seen approval ratings like yours so shortly after a candidate announced himself. Not all too surprising, considering the support you've been given, but it's still good to see things panning out like this, Reprieve elatedly explained, looking down on the assistant he was holding with one hand, while leaning heavily on his crutch with the other, trying to take some weight off of his remaining leg. After the talk he had had with HFY, he had taken over the duty of conducting the early morning briefings with the freak. It would take some stress off of his friend, and also give him something to do in the mornings that wasn't too much effort. James sat in his bed right in front of him and seemed to be only partially listening, which might have had something to do with the freak looking like he had just gotten done with a day-long march. The man had started to exercise regularly and strenuously, and unless he had a scheduled appointment that he needed to be presentable for, it was rare to see him in a condition that wasn't sweaty and exhausted. There was most certainly more to it than him just following the High Matriarch's request of getting himself into a respectable shape, but Reprieve couldn't think of any reasons that would exceed being anything but innocuous, so he decided that he may be better off not knowing. He looked down at the data on his assistant again, and noticed a small anomaly in it that made him smirk. You want to hear something funny? Your ratings are through the roof with many of the expected orders. Brosposkia and Pisanticides love you like we expected, and so do many of the predatory orders, especially Corvidae and Canines, he continued. And soon he noticed that James looked up ever so slightly, a glint of interest in his eyes. Clearly he was wondering where Reprieve was going with this. However, when it comes to primates, there's a bit of an anomaly. Overall, it seems like they are just as fond of you as most of the revered orders are, maybe even more so. However, there's an outlier. Reprieve made a dramatic pause at that to gauge James's reaction. However, the freak smiled to himself. Let me guess, the primate said, and sat up, leaning back on his arm and shifting his weight to that side of his body so he wouldn't fall out of balance. The human numbers alone are enough to make the ratings among go from very positive to mixed, aren't they? Well, he should have seen that much coming. It wasn't easy surprising the freak with anything, unless a considerable amount of stress and pressure was involved. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise that he was able to predict the reaction of a species he had specifically been chosen to represent. I've told you they wouldn't like me very much, James added with a scoff and an implied shrug. Well, that's not too much of a concern, Reprieve gave back with another look at the data. We don't expect them to yet. Your overall numbers are more than sufficient to be worked with. Besides, they don't even dislike you that much. Your people seem to be very mixed on the topic. That's good. It creates conversation. Give it some time and effort and things will be running smoothly in no time. Reprieve could have sworn that James almost unnoticeably rolled his eyes at that comment before he spoke up again and changed the topic. Anything new from Earth? He asked. And despite him clearly trying to make it seem like a passing question, he clearly got a lot more attentive as soon as the question had left his mouth, his gaze becoming a sharp focus instead of the lazy glances from before. Still, Reprieve saw no sense in denying his inquiry, so he quickly swiped away the data off the popularity poll, and instead opened the summary of his own briefing that he had gotten per mail even earlier that day automatically. Some of your representatives have been in correspondence with the Leader Supreme, he informed with a slight shake of his trunk. So far they have mostly just established that they recognise your desired candidate, as well as the Council's support of that decision, and that they are currently coordinating a response among themselves. They are asking for your patience, as apparently your announcement has caused quite a bit of unrest in some parts of the human population, and they would like to have a coherent course of action before taking any official stance on the topic. Well, that's understandable, James replied. Wouldn't be the first time the government made an embarrassment of itself with a hasty and uncoordinated response to the public. Well, I guess that's the same among every species, Reprieve concurred with a nod of his head, before he continued with the briefing. But while your governments aren't ready for any official talks yet, there are some people that want to talk to you. James leaned forward, taking his weight off of his arms just so he could lift it to wave the topic off. I know. We've already discussed this, remember? He said dismissively. From planetary leaders to celebrities, everyone is interested in getting a word in with the new top candidate for the seat in the council. I already told HFY this. I'll talk to those that are absolutely necessary. But even Tua can't be interested in having that many people rolling up here, can she? She isn't, Reprieve confirmed. We've compiled the more promising requests into a comprehensive list. He summoned up the file that contained names, professions, and general leanings of the people that had requested either an audience, an interview, or a mere conversation with the freak for the duration of the pre-election campaign, handing it over so James could take a look at it himself. Slowly, the man's dark eyes glided over the names, pausing at some a little longer than on others, but seeming genuinely disinterested. That was until he reached the very end of the list. "Who the hell is Alexander Page?" he near blurted out. And Reprieve couldn't help but chuckle at the clearly almost instinctual reaction to recognizing a human name on the list. "Someone who is very interested in what you are doing here," Reprieve informed him, and reached out to take his assistant from the human. James looked at him annoyed and lifted an eyebrow. "You mean what he thinks I'm doing here?" he clarified, his eyes narrowing in venomous suspicion. "Of course," Reprieve replied, and immediately wriggled his trunk as he saw James's demeanour almost immediately relax as soon as the words had left his mouth. "Although from the interactions we've had so far, he seems to be much more amiable than you have been." James sighed and lifted his hand to rub over his forehead. "Well, there's always crazes out there," he mumbled, and turned his arm to scratch his nape. "And you want me to talk to him as well?" "Of course," Reprieve replied, closing his eyes, and waving his assistant around lazily as he spoke. "There's still a thing or two he can learn from you. Maybe even some you can learn from him. Either way, any positive contact with your people is a welcome addition to your campaign." When he opened his eyes again, James was scowling at him. His dark eyes twitched in place, as if they were following his train of thought in real time. Then he snapped back to reality at an instant, immediately continuing the conversation like nothing had happened. It seemed that the freak already had an idea what this might mean for him in his position. After all, a more amiable advocate would be highly preferable to a hostile one, and James, while an important tool for their goal, was at the moment very much on the verge of being more of a liability than an asset. "Well, I can't exactly object," James concluded, although his face told of yet unanswered questions that he clearly didn't want to ask. Reprieve wondered if maybe he should pry a bit further to try and get to the bottom of the primate's insecurities. However, he decided against it, especially since he had absolutely no way of knowing whether the freak would even tell him the truth. But it was most certainly something to keep in mind and possibly look into. What about a human sympathizer contacting them could be so noticeably strange? "Correct," Reprieve said ruminatively, and turned the screen of his assistant off. "Well, anyway, that should be all for today. Keep up the good work and things will continue to go smoothly, for everyone involved." He looked directly into the freak's eyes as he said that, and the dark orb stared back into his predatorily. "No need to remind me," James said, right before he let himself fall onto his back and rolled around, turning his back leg towards Reprieve, who left the room at a brisk pace. As he stood in front of the door, he looked at the time. He realised that the briefing hadn't taken very long at all. Around the same time, he had started his constant exercise. The amount of sass and backtalk that James offered up towards everybody trying to work with him had also decreased significantly, making encounters go by much quicker in most circumstances. He likely wouldn't be expected back for a good bit longer. Mischievously, he looked around. Of course, guards and personnel were everywhere, but he wasn't worried about them. They really didn't care for his presence in the slightest, and apart from them, the coast was clear. He decided that he had to use the time that James had inadvertently brought for him. The truth was, when he had personally requested to be stationed at the estate to observe and work with the freak, James wasn't the only project he had a vested interest in working on. However, the other one was more of an off-the-books kind of project that he was working on by himself. Not one that he needed to keep secret by any stretch of the imagination, but he still preferred to do so. He simply didn't feel like explaining his reasoning behind it to anybody. However, that also meant that he could only work on it in moments of unrestricted free time he had completely to himself. And recently, it had been hard to find enough good excuses and opportunities to get away from Haifaty's caring presence. Not that he would usually mind. She was a great friend, and her behaviour came from her merely being worried about him as he adapted to his new, restricted lifestyle, afforded to him by the freak himself. However, to say she had been overbearing in the last days would have been him putting it lightly. So now that he had a moment, he quickly and quietly sneaked away. In the night of the same day, after he had already turned in for the night and most of the estate was fast asleep, giving him the opportunity to prepare the work he should actually be doing during the next day ahead of time, so that the time he should be spending on it would be free for him to use. It was times like these when not having the evolutionary burden of the need for actual sleep, hard-coded into his genetics, was one of the greatest luxuries his ancestry afforded him. It did afford him a not insignificant amount of usable time that normal people could not make use of. However, while he was engrossed in his work, which consisted mostly of preparing some bullet points that the freak would have to memorize and work through during the interviews with the POIs, someone suddenly knocked on his door. He looked up from his seat and inadvertently reached for his crutch that was leaned against his desk right next to him. "Who is it?" he asked. However, as he did, the door was already slowly being opened, with a familiar yet unexpected face peeking through the gap forming between door and frame. Reprieve basically jumped from his seat, barely managing to get his crutch on the ground, as to not fall to the ground face first as he hastily stepped forwards, his eyes wide as he stared up at his visitor's face. "Ajifunora, what are you doing here?" he instinctively asked in a hushed tone. He had not been informed about the High Matriarch's niece arriving at the estate. To his knowledge, nobody had. And while he usually wasn't averse to the young Matriarch to be, at the moment, her presence here was everything but gladdening. "Isn't it obvious?" the young Zodatius asked in a near whisper, and signaled with her trunk that Reprieve should keep it down as well. "I'm here to see James." "Impossible. No, unthinkable. Out of the question." All of these were things he wanted to respond to her proposition. However, any response like that would most definitely have brought up questions that Reprieve, at that moment, was not prepared to answer. In order to buy himself some time to think, he instead quickly asked, "When did you even arrive here? I've heard nothing of your visit. Does the High Matriarch know you're here yet?" The youngster waved the ends of her trunk around in quick, defensive movements. "I just got here, and Auntie is already asleep," she quickly informed him, and clearly she couldn't even fool herself with that pitiful excuse. "I really don't want to wake. She always has so much on her back. I don't want to bother her, just because I feel like talking to James." Reprieve looked at her unamused, crossing his arms over his crutch, and leaning his entire weight on it. Ajifunora looked back at him, sheepishly rubbing her head with her trunk as she realised he was seeing right through her. "Right, maybe I also don't want her to embarrass me in front of James again," she admitted, with an awkward chuckle. "And if she knew I was here, I know she would insist on being around when I talked to him." Reprieve lifted his trunk mockingly. "Do you find your aunt embarrassing?" he asked teasingly, leaning onto his crutch even more. "No, that's not it," Ajifunora immediately rejected, stretching out her trunk straight in his direction. "She's not embarrassing, she's amazing. She just really likes embarrassing me, specifically." She let her trunk sink down in a clearly deep-seated disappointment. Reprieve snicked to himself while the Zodatius took a closer look at him. "I'm sorry," she said hesitantly. "What happened to your leg, I mean?" Reprieve looked down at his missing limb, as if he needed to confirm for himself that it was still gone, before he could answer. "What are you sorry for?" he asked, looking back up at the young woman. "It's not like it's your fault." "I know, but..." Ajifunora started once again, but Reprieve cut her off. "It's fine. Thank you for your condolences," he said quickly. There was a moment of heavy silence in the room that held for a few seconds. Finally, Ajifunora cleared her throat loudly and deliberately. "So, about that visit," she said, cheekily bringing the conversation back to the original topic. Reprieve sighed, although he couldn't deny a certain amusement in his voice, as he replied, "Listen, the ambassador is a very busy man with a very busy schedule. Without an appointment, it's going to be hard to get even a moment of his time." Ajifunora looked disappointed for only a second before she impishly spoke up once more, asking, "Could you at least ask? For me?" Reprieve sighed once more. Just moments later, they were on their way through the estate, trying to act natural to not raise the suspicion of any of the guards that were still awake and protecting the mansion and the important people who live within it. "I still can't believe that Auntie Apo never told me that he was here all this time," Ajifunora complained under her breath, as they made their way through the halls. "I mean, she must have known that I want to talk to him and make sure he's alright after everything that happened. I was also on the station when all of that chaos went down." Reprieve shifted uncomfortably while trying to keep pace with her last strides with his own, hectic limping, his crutch clacking loudly each time he catapulted himself forward with it. "It's not her fault," he lied through his teeth, managing to hide his true intentions much better than the young Zodaitis did. "After the attack on the station, and his and my own unfortunate fate, James didn't want any eyes on him for a while. The attack left him a changed man. Now he wants to make change, and he only told a select few that he was staying with your aunt for a bit while he planned for his election campaign. He has big plans, but he needed time to work out how he wanted to achieve them." That was the official version. A well-practiced lie that anybody in the know could recite at the drop of a hat without so much as a stutter. "And why wasn't I part of the select few, huh?" Ajifunora asked, clearly unsatisfied with that answer. Reprieve laughed off the problem. "He probably didn't want to burden you with his problems. It is far from your problem, after all," he replied, slightly out of breath due to having to keep up the brisk pace she was still walking at. "But you can let him know your discomfiture yourself." He lifted his free hand as well as his trunk to point at the door of James's room turned cell, indicating that they had reached their goal. Luckily, with the combined authority of himself and the niece of the High Matriarch herself, there weren't many questions being asked by the guards, and with Ajifunora at his side, He didn't even need their help to open the door for once. Still, he indicated for her to stay outside and wait for him to call her in, while he prepared James for her arrival. However, getting a spunky young Saditos to listen to you was a challenge even for their colossal elders. So, what chance did a lone Sipperslang have? Ajifunora basically stormed past him into the room. Reprieve could do little but hurry in as well and make sure that James knew he had eyes on him, while the youngster talked to him. However, he looked on in astonishment as he realised that the room was empty. Not only that, but it almost looked like a fight had taken place in it. The large bed was turned over, the mattress and sheets thrown thoughtlessly onto the ground, and the frame leaned against the wall. And James was nowhere in sight, sleeping or otherwise. Had he been attacked? Was he gone? Surely the guards would have mentioned something like that when they had arrived. Besides, who would even be around that would be in any way interested in attacking James? What happened here? Ajifunora took the question right out of his mind, and she sounded just as concerned as Reprieve felt. Reprieve opened his mouth to answer, or at least tell her that he didn't know. However, he was interrupted. His heart stopped for a moment, as Ajifunora shrieked a trumpeting shriek, sending a shock through his entire body as he shot around to see what had startled her so much. The giant girl stomped in place, shaking her head in an attempt to shake something that had landed on her head off of her, but the pale figure managed to keep his balance on her head despite the shaking. Easy, easy. You're gonna throw me off, James loudly announced. And hearing his voice, Ajifunora froze dead in her tracks. James! She blurted out, her eyes rolling up in a futile attempt to catch a glimpse of the small man that had landed on her head. In the flesh, James replied, softly patting the top of the girl's head. You should be more careful. It was way too easy to ambush you like this. Ajifunora giggled. Why would anybody ambush us? Carefully, she reached up with her trunk, seemingly wanting to lift the primate off of her head, but stopping just before her appendage made contact with him. Most likely, she remembered his previous aversion to being touched by her. However, James reached out to her on his own, touching one of her trunk's ends with his hand. It's fine. Help me down from here, he said softly. And Reprieve watched in slight surprise as he allowed himself to be entwined by the girl's trunk and was gently lowered to the ground. While it was true that James didn't instinctually pull away from a touch of his Saditos anymore, it was rare that he sought any contact with him willingly. In fact, Reprieve could remember only one time, and now that he thought of it, that was with Ajifunora as well. Maybe the girl really had earned his respect. As the trunk wrapped around James, one of the ends of her trunk carefully grazed the scarred skin over his empty shoulder. Admiring my beauty, Mark? The primate asked, as soon as she had set him down on the ground. His tone was mellow and restrained, not nearly as humorous as Reprieve had come to expect from such a tongue-in-cheek remark. I'm sorry, Ajifunora quickly replied and pulled her trunk back. James chuckled. It's fine, he said genuinely. I'd rather it be me than others. Reprieve noticed the primate throwing a quick glance at him while the girl was distracted, his expression dark, and a single eyebrow raised. Subtly, but definitely clear enough for James to notice, Reprieve shook his head. James acknowledged with a slight nod before his expression changed back to the well-practiced, jovial smile from before. It's good to see you again, Ajifunora. He now properly greeted the young lady. Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Ajifunora gave back immediately, and happily raised her trunk. But say, what were you doing under the ceiling? The girl looked up at the light fixtures above her head, which clearly had to be what James had dropped down from earlier. If the Saditos had to look up, something was really high above the floor. Apparently James had used the frame of his bed as a ladder to climb up the wall and make himself at home, almost 10 measures in the air. It looked cozy up there, James replied, meandering through the room lazily before sitting down on the mattress he had so lazily thrown onto the floor. I'm a primate, I'm drawn to higher places. It's also a good place to train. Ajifunora looked taken aback by that revelation. To train? But what if you fall down? She asked in mild shock, and took another look up at the, to her, surely flimsy-looking fixtures. Easy, I just don't, James gave back with an exaggerated laugh. Ajifunora didn't seem quite satisfied with that answer, but she didn't push the topic. Reprieve cleared his throat, making the two look at him curiously. I'm glad that you're happy to see each other, but I have to remind you that we should keep this visit brief, he called to mind with a look at the door. Not only is James very busy, but you also hear off the books. Say what you want to say and ask what you want to ask, and then we get out of here. Oh? James immediately jumped on his statement with a curious sideways glance. You allowed her to come here off the book? Who are you and what have you done to Reprieve? Very funny, Reprieve immediately replied, and looked at James annoyed. Ajifunora giggled at their bickering. Reprieve doesn't break rules, but you can get him to bend them when you do it right, she explained to James. The primate looked unconvinced, but also seemed to ponder that statement for a moment. That's so, he murmured, and Reprieve didn't like the tone of his voice as he did so. Tick-tock, people, he reminded once more, before retreating from the conversation, before the freak got any bright ideas. The ensuing conversation and catching up of the two was of limited interest. James merely gave a summary of the story he had studied together with Reprieve and Hyphaty, so there was nothing new to hear there, and Ajifinora's stories weren't exactly any more exciting. The education to become a matriarch at some point was quite rigorous, after all, so most of her stories were based around what her teachers asked of her, or what mundane tasks she had to fulfill over and over. None of the most exciting of upbringings, even if it led to one of the more exciting lives later on. The thing of particular note that Reprieve noticed was James, despite acting in his role the entire time, seemed to fall into a certain relaxation that he hadn't expressed in a long time. His smile and laugh seemed genuine, and so did his compassion as he listened to her honestly risible problems when compared to his own situation. That girl. There was something to her. A matriarch she wasn't, not yet, but there was something to her indeed. And he said, well, it's hard to explain, but vaguely translated. He said something like, if you do that, you might as well carry logs over the water. Ajifunora said, in the middle of another story. That's a proverb of sorts, based on an old legend of a guy doing Sisyphus tasks. Sisyphus task? James offered. At least that's what it sounded like. Reprieve didn't understand what he meant. And apparently neither did Ajifunora, because she immediately asked, a what? Never mind, James replied, laughing off his own comment. Also a proverb. He laughed for a few moments before suddenly freezing up. Reprieve curiously looked at the freak as he started to behave strangely, almost like he had noticed something. Ajifunora didn't notice at first and wanted to continue the conversation. However, James immediately shushed her, indicating with a finger in front of his mouth to remain quiet. Reprieve now also listened up. However, he couldn't make out anything unusual, just the typical far-off booming noise that was caused by Tshirt walking around the estate. What's wrong? Ajifunora asked concernedly, ignoring James's order to be quiet. Your aunt is coming, James immediately replied, looking at the door with belly-suppressed worry and disdain. Ajifunora looked confused and now also became worried, glancing over at the door. How do you know that? She asked, and it was a question Reprieve would have very much liked to have answered as well. I'd recognise those footsteps out of 1,000, James replied in a quick, hushed manner, and jumped up to his feet. He recognised the footsteps? There were footsteps nearing him from outside the door, but they sounded just like any other Tshirt walking. And there's someone with her, James continued his earlier statement. Somebody big. Sadly, if steps were close enough for even James's ears to pick them up, that meant it was also too late to do anything about it. Before any more action could be taken, the massive entrance to his cell already started to be pushed open, and the only thing James could do was to step protectively in front of Ajifunora, in a maybe brave but definitely pointed gesture of instinctual heroism. Meanwhile, he noticed Reprieve standing at attention to his right. The first to enter through the door was the matriarch herself. To James's confusion, she looked neither surprised nor angry to see her niece in his cell, as her eyes landed on Ajifunora. Her expression was merely displeased. Auntie Apo! Ajifunora immediately greeted her aunt with a badly acted excitement, standing up straight, raising her trunk up high. I didn't know you were awake, However, her voice stopped in her throat, and her expression went from feigned excitement to a middle ground between nervousness and terror, as soon as she saw the second figure that entered through the enormous door. Ajifunora, dearest. Oh, Droplet, it's so good to have finally found you. A thundering voice filled the room, as the huge, dark form pushed its way into the empty space. Contextualizing size differences between Tshirt was hard. They were all massive, after all, and so far none had reached the height of the High Matriarch, who had so far seemed to be an exceptional specimen, even among her colossal people. However, this was different. Inadvertently, James took a step back, as he only now realised that this was, so far, the first time he had ever seen a male Tshirt. They were a matriarchal society, but it seemed that wasn't based on any bodily advantages, as the leanly built Tshirt bull was at least another measure taller than even the matriarch, and seemed to have almost negative body fat percentages. Other than the female counterparts, or at least the ones that James had seen so far, that at least somewhat resembled elephants on Earth, with enough imagination, this bull seemed to be made purely of muscle, his thick skin stretching over it tightly, and therefore reminded more of a giraffe with a split trunk, tusks the size of small trees, and on the universe's most powerful steroids. The 6 dark eyes of the bull completely ignored James, as they stared at the girl that clearly knew this person to be a not only imposing, but plainly terrorizing figure.
"Girlfriend!"
Ajifunora gasped under her breath, and James could see the physical discomfort that this man's presence seemed to cause her, as she squirmed in place nervously.
"I was quite surprised when he showed up on my doorstep tonight,"
Tua chimed into the conversation, and James noticed that even she tried to maneuver herself in between the girl and the man, although she didn't seem to be concerned about his presence in the slightest.
"But apparently my dear sister has been worried sick after you snuck out and decided to send Girlfriend to look out for you here while she searched elsewhere."
"It wouldn't have been necessary for you to come all this way out here," Ajifunora said, clearly addressing not her aunt but the man. "I'm fine. I don't want to come home on my own." Despite his imposing nature and Ajifunora's clear fear of him, this girlfriend showed absolutely no signs of aggression.
"Well, I don't need a dire reason to visit our dear High Matriarch, Droplet,"
he explained himself in calm, measured, and to James's brief disgust, slightly flirty tone. At least it seemed his advances were directed at Tua and not the young girl.
"And while I'm here, I can also ensure that you make it home all right."
"But if you would prefer to go home by your lonesome, I can assure you that Girlfriend and I have no objections to a little time to ourselves,"
Tua said with an almost girlish giggle that sent a cold shiver down James's spine. Apparently, Ajifunora didn't expect to get such an offer twice, and she immediately started to hurry out of the room.
"Well, you said my mother was worried about me, so I should probably get going sooner rather than later,"
she babbled, while trying to take the way out that would involve the least proximity to the large ball.
"Success to all of you. It was nice talking to you, James. We should repeat this sometimes."
"Success to you," James managed to yell after her, before she had already disappeared out of the door. James glanced over to Reprieve, who appeared to be rooted in place in his respectful position, a hint of nervousness on his face. So, this man was not just scary to huge little girls, it seemed. James looked back and forth between the two remaining Saditas, deciding to keep his cool about him. "If you two are actually going to go at it, I'd prefer it if you..." James started to say, but a movement in his periphery made his instincts scream out, and he stumbled back while getting his head down, just in time to feel his hair get blown around by the draft of something passing by just above his head with considerable speed. It took a few more steps backward, and stared up at the Saditas bull with wide eyes. The man stood high, his trunk still raised threateningly, even after the attack. That hadn't been an attempt to touch his head like so many of them did. It hadn't even been a scolding slap. Had it hit him, that attack would have sent him flying.
"That's enough, Girlfriend,"
the matriarch immediately and authoritatively said in a very strict tone, and the man immediately let his trunk sink down.
"I will not tolerate anyone speaking to you in such a tone in my presence, High Matriarch,"
the bull replied in a determined yet humble tone, and bowed his head to the point that it was lower than that of the matriarch. Then, with a venomous look towards James, he repeated himself.
"Not anyone."
Tua seemed to completely ignore his display. However, she did position herself closer to James, possibly to interject should it come to another altercation.
"This is James Aldwin,"
she introduced, gesturing down at James with her trunk and forgoing any reply to Girlfriend's statement.
"I have told you about him."
"Yes, the ambassador,"
the bull replied, and lifted his head again, just so he could look down at James with that slight bit more in height advantage.
"Although I must say, I can't see what threat your guards may have seen in such a meager being."
Tua chortled amusedly.
"Even you would do good not to underestimate a human, dear," she said,
to which Girlfriend made a dismissive sound. Still a slight bit shaken, but determined to not let himself be put down just like that, James asked immediately, "And you are?" To his satisfaction, it seemed that the question brought exactly the message across that he had intended it to. "You weren't important enough to be introduced to me or even be talked about, so why would I care what you think?" James could feel his head pump all the way up to his head, as the dark eyes of the Colossus found his own, challenging gaze, and the air between them seemed to fill with intensity, but he managed to stand firm.
"Girlfriend,"
the bull said briefly, seemingly having nothing to add to that. "What, that's all?" James mocked. "And is that a title or a name?" Usually Saditos had 3 names, so clearly either he was omitting something, or there was more going on here.
"Girlfriend is a title, a name, basically a state of being,"
Tua informed helpfully, and clearly tried to calm the storm that was clearly brewing within her walls.
"Let me make it more understandable for you, as you aren't familiar with our ways. The Girlfriend is the man at the side of the current matriarchs of our people. He is the father of Ajifunora and partner of my sister, or mine should I desire so. He is also an enforcer of my will and holds a position of great influence in what remains of our military structure. In short, he is somebody you should respect.
In short, he is the rabid dog on your short leash, James corrected her in his mind. I can only reiterate, he said, after a moment of contemplation. If you two want to do it, then not in my room.
What did you talk about?
Tu asked directly and coldly, ignoring his clear attempts at provocation, and holding any reaction of her enforcer back with a simple lifting of her trunk.
With Ajifunora, I mean.
James looked up at her defiantly. Then he allowed his face to relax. I'm keeping my end of the bargain, he informed her, serious but matter of fact. Just make doubly sure that you are doing the same. Acknowledging his presence for the first time since her arrival, Tua glanced over at Reprieve. The rodent simply nodded his head, making his trunk shake slightly, as he looked back up at the matriarch.
Good,
Tua said, and at the snap of her finger, her voice had the happy, high and sickly sweet tone that she always used at first when talking to James.
Things are so much better for all of us if we just get along.
She then turned to girlfriend, and James could have sworn that he noticed a certain eagerness on her part to get the Colossus out of James's cell. Maybe she actually didn't like the tension he brought to the situation. Or maybe James was just imagining things.
Well, now that you've already come all this way, let me at least get you something before you see yourself off again. We've gone together too rarely in recent times, she said, and started to guide the ball out of James's room, with her trunk wrapped around his tusk. He took one last disdainful look at James before following the leadership of his High Matriarch, without resistance or protest. The door shut behind the proboscia with a loud slam, and James could almost feel the entire room take a deep breath, though in reality, it was just him and Reprieve. A good reaction. Reprieve suddenly commended James for the primary surprise. I thought he was going to hit you for sure. He sounded earnest. Thanks, James replied, and threw a glance at the door once again. Lovely fellow, isn't he? You have no idea, Reprieve replied, also looking towards the door. And after that display, I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of him from now on. James snickered. Sorry about that, he said. And he even kind of meant it. Kind of. Don't be, Reprieve replied to his repeated surprise. That means he won't be at home as much. What did you say again? You'd rather have it be you than others? That's exactly right, James gave back. A moment of awkward silence emerged between the two Deathworlders, as they stood in the quiet room and stared at the door. Finally, Reprieve turned his head towards James, asking, Hey, freak? What's up? James replied, returning his gaze. Reprieve took a deep breath. I hate you, he finally brought out with a chuckle. The feeling's mutual, James gave back, and he still absolutely meant it.